All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning from the Escazú office of Costa Rica Real Estate. We're here live once again for our weekly webinar. The title for today's talk is Auctions. Is this a sign of desperation or a sign of genius? That's a comment that we hear often from clients when they hear about auctions. And I'm very proud to welcome today Tina Wallace, a good friend and project manager at Concierge Auctions. Welcome, Tina. Good morning to you.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you again vis-a-vis the computer.
It's great to see you.
These days, but good to see you. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, our pleasure. A brief intro obviously is valid here. I can say that our company has had the pleasure of working with Concierge Auctions, I believe in five auctions in the last 18 months. Concierge Auctions, we got to know them many years ago through our relationship at the Who's Who in luxury real estate. And, I have to say, Tina, it's something that I joke about with our good friend Danny over there at Concierge as well, that when I first heard about the auction process in Costa Rica due to the idiosyncrasies of our market here, I, like many of our clients, buyers and sellers, had a lot of skepticism, right? I went into, what's this all about? And is this another play to try to get people involved? Where's the catch? What's the trick? Is it really going to work? And very pleased 18 plus months later after our first experience to say, not only am I rid of my skepticism, but I'm a firm believer that for a segment of the market, buyers and sellers, it's a fantastic process. I mean, at the end of the day, our job at Costa Rica Real Estate and all of our brokers and agents is to service our clients. And sellers in Costa Rica who've experienced what's been a buyer's market for the better part of 5 years, know that you have to get creative, and it requires an agent who can think outside of the box, and it requires looking for different solutions. And Concierge Auctions and the luxury auction process for us has been a great source of a solution set for particular properties, particular sellers who have specific needs, which we'll get into in today's call. And for us, it's been a joy working with you and Danny and the whole team at Concierge. Perhaps before we get started with the FAQs and what the auction how it works, excuse me, probably worth a quick intro to what's going on in the market. For those who've seen my previous webinars, I'll make this really quick because they've heard this before. But as I mentioned, pre-COVID and certainly during COVID, this is a buyer's market, both here in the city in the Central Valley, which is a market where I'm based here in Escazú, servicing really La Sabana, Escazú and Santana principally, but do some sales other locations as well. And then, of course, in our coastal markets, Santa Teresa, Manuel Antonio, Dominical, Jaco, likewise, it's been a buyer's market there, and we're seeing a tremendous amount of activity in the city. It's a primary market. It's not a second home market. So there's a lot of activity in the marketplace here. A lot of people whose decision making has been accelerated perhaps by what's taken place with pandemic and how that affects their living. And at the beach, we're seeing a lot of pent up increased demand, which we think we'll see the fruits of at some point in the future, of course, when the airports and restrictions are laxed. But I guess having said all that, an important question to you perhaps would be, given the current market conditions, both in the city and on the coast, why do an auction now? Can an auction take place now? What has the success rate been for Concierge in the U.S. with their other auctions that they've carried out over the past 3 months? So maybe you can give us a little intro to what's going on in your world, and then we'll get into the details of the auction.
I'll start just for everyone to know, I'm based in the beach. I've been living in Costa Rica for 15 years, and I'm very lucky to be working with you, Todd, and Danny, who is brought me on with Concierge Auctions originally. He's a business developer, and so having always lived at the beach and previously been selling real estate at the beach, I've been able to keep quite up to speed with what goes on in this market, just as you have a very, very strong handle of what's happening in the city. And when I speak to brokers here, I think circling back to, what we're dealing with right now with COVID is we've got Costa Rica is considered a country that's dealt with this issue very, very well. And as such, there is a lot of interest for people as we hopefully move out of it sooner rather than later. At least I'm seeing here at the beach from a second home perspective, which is traditionally what the beach market is. We have a lot of interest from clients that are saying, listen, we want to come back as soon as we can get back. We want to look at properties, not only for full-time living, it might be for part-time living, or it might be just simply for rental revenue. And I always have my ear to the ground because, most of sellers will traditionally come and speak to you, and then you'll speak to me if we think that the platform's appropriate. And then buyers that are working with, their brokers can sit there and say, listen, what is coming up available? If I look at what Concierge Auctions has done in the last 3 months globally, they've had wonderful success. They've sold to date 26 properties, and that was through COVID. So many of those homes sold sight unseen through virtual tours. And you and I can certainly speak to having had some success here with sight unseen purchases.
Sure.
We just recently had a property sell in Aspen that had been on the market for 3 years at $30 million. And we sold that within the auction cycle in 14 days. So
wow.
We're, as people are becoming more educated to what we do, and as we have more buyers recognizing what the opportunity is, and we can get into this later, but why sellers choose to work with us. I was nervous when COVID hit. I was like, what's going to happen to our market here? And it's considered, I think it's considered, we're continuing along exactly the way we should be on par. And you and I continue to have expressed interest in how does the Concierge Platforms auction, the platform work?
Great. Good insight. I thought maybe for format today, what we might do is at the beginning, let's maybe address the frequently asked questions. I'm just going to bring them up without answering them because I think most of them will be answered as we get into the dialogue of how the process works. But I think it's important for those who are listening to know that we probably know what they're asking. And so I'll bring those up at the beginning of the call. Then we'll go through some of the important steps in the process of how the auction actually works. And then at the end of the call, we'll come back to some of those questions and any questions that any of our viewers may have, and we'll address those one-on-one. So starting off, one of the first ones that I hear from sellers all the time, or just, the birds who are chirping in the trees is, I'm not desperate. Why would I ever sell at auction? I'm not, I don't need the money.
Right.
And I think we'll get into it obviously in depth, but at the end of the day, needing to sell has nothing to do with wanting to sell, and a process that creates liquidity is a good solution for anybody. So the next one that we hear a lot is, is this really a no reserve auction? What does that mean? And is it really going to sell no matter what the price is, right? I mean, is it no reserve, or where's the trick? Where's the catch?
Well, do you want me to jump in? Do you want me to jump
go ahead.
Clarify that?
Sure.
When you and I and Danny sit down with clients, you have two options within the process, right? You can have a reserve auction or you can have a non-reserve auction. And so with the reserve auction, obviously we have a set price that is determined by the seller and ourselves, okay? And that is an option for some properties. And then we have the, option of the non-reserve. If you want me to go into detail on that right now, or do you want me to?
Sure, you can go into detail on that. Yeah, go ahead.
So, with the non-reserve auction, which you and I think we've done the majority of our auctions here have been non-reserve. And that's where we basically work with buyers and allow them to have, an incentive to come in and purchase. And it's called an OBI, or opening bid incentive. And that sets up basically the platform for the seller to know exactly where the price of their home will potentially sell. So when you and I've had these discussions with our sellers, we just determine what's going to work better for them, right? And I don't know, I think you and I both agree that for the most part, we like a non-reserve auction.
Yeah, I mean, I think out of all the auctions we've done, we did one auction at no reserve, and by nature, with a reserve. We did one auction with a reserve, and the rest of them were non-reserve auctions. And by nature, I mean, let's be honest, right? People get excited, buyers get excited about an auction when they sense opportunity. And so by placing a reserve, while it works so long as the reserve is exciting enough or low enough, if you will, versus previous list price and market price where buyers will get excited, it can work. But the non-reserve or no reserve auction clearly is what drives opportunity and, one of my favorite terms in real estate, sense of urgency, right? Nobody reacts, nobody moves unless they have to in a no reserve auction. It's really what changed my mind, I think, about the skepticism that I had going into our first auction was, will the auction truly drive sense of urgency? Will it bring people into a process that not only might not have paid what they paid, but people that might not have even been in the marketplace, right? That's been, for me, the biggest pleasant surprise for my sellers that enter an auction is that sense of urgency and opportunity that a no reserve auction drives into the marketplace, brings people that if I, as good as I like to think that myself and our team are, we couldn't get them into an open market sale because it's not, there's no reason to act today in such a buyer's market. So I think, the reserve auction is an option that we've really reserved, I think, both for the auction that we want, the one auction that we did, and several that we're in discussions with now with sellers. For those that have, for example, a mortgage on the property, where we'll place a reserve so that at least the seller knows we can cover and we can close, of course, for the buyer's perspective as well. But for the most part, we certainly recommend that no reserve because it's I think just in history, both with my limited experience as well as what I've heard from concierge, it's really what is driving much more success. So
and just to finish on the reserve, because I agree with you that with the reserve is that, when we're working with our sellers, if we have a realistic reserve number, we still get a very interesting field that will usually come in and begin to bid. So, and we'll probably discuss this during the call, is having a realistic seller, right? And I think that we're very, very good at talking to our sellers and determining, what is that number? What is the expectation? Is it realistic? And whether the format of the reserve or the non-reserve will be better. And your example of the one that we did do as a reserve, it made more sense. And
absolutely.
It allowed us to have a field that was where the seller needed that field to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into seller expectation here in a moment. And I think the no reserve question or the comment that we're talking about leads me to the next FAQ, which is, can the seller walk away? Can the seller back out of the auction if he's not happy? If they go into a no reserve auction, I always get the question, let's say we had a $3 million property and there's a no reserve auction. And while I've never seen something like this, and the highest bid was, $500,000, for example, and the seller just says, there's no chance of that. And the question that I get oftentimes, and I speak openly with buyers and sellers about this one point, because I think it's important to understand the encompassing process, is there a walk away point for that seller, and how does that work? So
the answer is yes. And I will say this, it doesn't happen very often. We try and have a very transparent conversation always with our sellers. And again, it goes back to realistic expectations. So you and I have done many site tours together. And when we feel, or when a seller feels that they want to engage us further in a conversation about going through the auction process with us, there is a transparency on where we feel bids will be it non-reserve or the reserve. If we don't think that we can sell something at reserve, we're going to be honest with you. Non-reserve, same deal. And you and I have had the conversation. I like to feel that the majority of our sellers, when they enter into a contract with us, have realistic expectations. And fortunately, we have met those expectations. I think actually on all of our auctions, we have met those expectations. We've always hit the range that we said that we would be in. And listen, it does happen. There's sellers that at the end of a cycle, which is 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes change their minds. And that's just something I can't control it. I think we do an excellent job of vetting our sellers so they're committed to the process. If they choose not to move forward, and there is that option, there is a financial penalty.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Tina, just to interrupt for a sec, I think, and we'll get into this point in a few minutes when we talk about the step-by-step of the process of the auction, but I think what's important at this point of our dialogue for people to understand is that there's no free ride. You know, the auction process, one of the things that the auction process does is it brings committed buyers and committed sellers. You know,
Correct.
This is not an option for a seller who just wants to test the roller coaster, and if they get halfway through and realize their seatbelt's unfastened, then they're just going to tell the guys to pull the track. So there is a financial penalty which is substantial, which certainly is probably the strongest way to pre-qualify those sellers. And we'll get into maybe a little bit further in the dialogue where in the process do they have that one-time opportunity and how that works. Maybe the next question that I'd like to just bring up as an FAQ is, the pre-qualifications. A lot of our sellers will say, well, how do I know who's participating? And are these people real? Are they ghost buyers? Who are the buyers? And how do you, as a company, how does Concierge help to pre-qualify to ensure that people that sign up, people that place an opening bid, and people who are on the bidding form process, how do we know they're real, and what do they need to do in order to participate in the process so that we can provide for our sellers comfort that the process is fully vetted?
Simple answer is, if you want to participate in my auction, you have to give me a proof of funds letter from your financial institution showing me that you can pay for this property within 30 days of the auction closing. And you have to put in a $100,000 deposit, which is refundable within 72 hours of the auction close if you don't win the property. If you can't provide me with those two items, you don't participate in my auction. Simple as that. If you want a longer version, I'm going to date myself a bit. I've been in real estate for 20 years now. I think I'm fairly good at vetting buyers. I listen to what people are looking for. I listen to their needs, as do you. I deal with a lot of the Concierge Auctions database. I like to feel that they're very well vetted themselves. We have repeat clients. We have repeat customers. Every auction cycle, I'm dealing with very similar clients or repeat clients that have had interest in our homes. But finally, if you can't give me that letter and if you can't give me your money, you're not participating. And so that for a seller provides them a little bit of comfort that they're not wasting their time.
I'll be honest, Tina, not just for seller. I mean, for a broker who's been in the business for 20 years in Costa Rica, where we don't have the same rules, regulations, and standard process that, those who are listening in the US may be used to.
Right.
Having such a tight vetting process for a sale in Costa Rica is unheard of. And so for a broker to be able to transmit to my clients and sellers that we're able to provide that for them is of tremendous value. So that to me has been one of the greatest aspects of the process for sure. Another question I get oftentimes is you talk about, and we'll get into a little further, but you talk about the opening bids. And if I place an opening bid, I get an opening bid incentive. But what if I miss that deadline? Can I bid the day before the auction? When is the cutoff to actually participate outside of the opening bids?
You can bid right up to auction close as long as I have your deposit and your letter from your financial institution. So we certainly, and you and I have gone through this, where we've had people, we've already opened up the auction, and with traditionally their 3 days, we've had people come in at the last minute and have wanted to participate. As long as you can give me that letter and your money, you can participate. You just don't qualify for the incentive, which we'll talk about later, but sure. Come in, start to bid. Right?
Yeah, I remember I think our last auction at the beginning, it must have been February, we closed on that auction, and we had a buyer, I think, sign up about 45 minutes or 2 hours prior to the end of auction. So it's an exciting piece of it, and for the seller, obviously, that obviously helps to drive a higher price and higher demand in a competitive field for them. So that's great news for them. One last thing before we get into, the advantages of an auction and how it works and what properties qualify is, I get the question from sellers often as to what is everybody's role. So I know you, Todd, you're a broker from Costa Rica Real Estate. You know, here's Tina. Tina's with Concierge. She's the project manager. And so maybe from a brokerage perspective, I'll answer what our role is, and then you can talk to us a little bit about project manager. So for our sellers, I tell them it's real simple. I still remain what I would be if you were in the open market. I'm your listing agent, and it is my responsibility to work with our clients from our database. It is our responsibility to continue to market the property through our own methods in our marketing department and our tools and resources. It's our responsibility to show the property, provide feedback, do the things that we would do in a standard process if we were on the open market, with the advantage that obviously we have both a project manager from Concierge and the marketing arm that goes along with it, which Concierge brings to the table. And so now you can maybe talk to us a little bit about your role as project manager, what you do throughout the process, and then of course how we work together.
Correct. So when we have a property that we're going to go to auction with, which is normally the cycle's 4 to 6 weeks, my role after we have done all of our kind of marketing material and we've got everything set in place is I traditionally go to wherever the home is. So if I'm based at the beach, I come to, let's say we're in the city, I come up and I'm living in San Jose for the 4-week cycle. Depending on how we determine to market the property, sometimes it's open houses, sometimes it's by appointment only. Obviously during this time right now, we've been, it's appointment only. My role is to do the showings for the most part, unless for some reason I'm not available. We have a wonderful relationship and you've done showings for me. My role is also to work with the database that Concierge Auctions has. We have with our marketing that we do. I work with leads that come in on a daily basis. These days it was through virtual tours, through photography, through appointments if people want to come through and see properties. If we have people that are interested in bidding, it is my job to explain the process to them. It is my job to make sure that their deposit is in. It is my job to make sure that the proof of funds letter is in. And it is my job to educate them through the cycle from beginning to end. It's also my job to then explain to the seller, along with yourself, who our field of buyers is. So my job is to know who is going to be actually bidding on the property. It's my job to be responsible for those buyers when we are open, when the auction is open. And once the auction closes, the winning bidder actually then goes into your hands, because that's where my role stops. We are basically a marketing company. You are the real estate agent. If there's a co-broker involved, your job is to work with the co-broker. My job is to basically deal with the bidders from beginning to end.
Yeah, that's an important clarification too, which I always like to make sure the sellers understand, is that once the auction is over, we will go into a 30-day closing period, and I will handle that along with attorneys like a standard real estate transaction. So good. That's some great insight. Cutting to the chase here, let's talk a little bit about what are the advantages of an auction from a buy perspective and from a seller perspective. Why an auction, right? So from a buyer's perspective, what are the advantages of an auction? And then I want to hear from a seller's perspective, same thing. We've touched on a few of them, so we can run through that fairly quickly, but I think this is an important one.
Well, for both buyer and seller, you're dealing with a person who's committed to selling their property, right? And for a buyer, I think that's a wonderful thing to know that if they're going to participate in the auction, they know that they have an opportunity to buy this home and they have got a committed seller. They also can purchase the home at a price they've determined in their head, right? So they know what their cap is going to be. They can go in. I try and provide as many comps as I can. Usually buyers come in with a kind of an idea of where they want to be in the market, and they can determine that price and know that if they win, they're purchasing their home without issue.
Right.
Right.
And from a seller's perspective, that's where we generally see more doubt, right? The people that are like I was, right? A skeptic and right. How's this going to work? And why should I really do this? And what's the risk? And should I really commit? What are the top advantages when you talk to a seller as to why taking their property to auction makes sense?
Well, they have a defined date of sale. I mean, I'm going to say to them that the auction cycle is going to start, June 1, and 90 days later, they're going to have their money cash in hand without any contingencies and with any subjects. And so they get that liquidity, and I can tell them exactly what day it's going to stop. Their home will be signed. And I think that's the biggest motivation for sellers when they come to concierge auctions, is because they do want that defined date.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. One of the other things that I would add to that, and certainly that's clearly number one, especially, in the US and other markets where you guys work, where, multiple bidders and things of that sort, the level of demand per property is much higher just based on the volume in the marketplace. In Costa Rica, I would say for my sellers, I tell them, it's rare. I can count on, my two hands and feet the amount of opportunities where I've ever seen multiple offers on a property.
Right.
And providing a seller with what I would consider to be the most competitive opportunity ever to get the most eyes on the property at one time, and more than likely to have multiple bidders trying to buy the property, it's going to give them the best opportunity to get the best price for the property. It doesn't mean, and I'm clear with them about this, it doesn't mean it's going to drive their property outside of a market value and give them some astronomical figure that doesn't exist. But clearly, you're going to get the highest price when you have more than one person that wants your property. That's just simple logic, and we've seen it, and it works very well for our sellers. And it's just something that, as good as we are, is difficult for a broker in a buyer's market that we live in to create anything similar to that. And it's been, for me, the most impressive piece of what concierge can really bring to the table, is that the platform, how polished, frankly, the rules, the policies, and the restrictions and the requirements help vet buy and sell side to create a process that just works very, very well. So that piece is really important. And I guess the final piece, which we already touched on, but it's worth me bringing it up because, again, from a broker's perspective, is critical. Qualified buyers. When I talk to a seller about, hey, we're going to have 3 to 5 bidders, or 2 to 4 bidders, or 5 to 7 bidders, or whatever. And when I say bidder, it's not a guy with a mask in front of his face, a guy who's given us proof of funds, who has $100,000 non-refundable in escrow. He's prepared to close. And one of the most critical components, aside from the financial vetting, is that all of our properties go through a pre-due diligence process, whereas brokers and as concierge, we require all the diligence documents up front. They're uploaded. Clients are able, before they sign up and before they deposit, must review, approve, and sign off on those diligence documents. So for the seller, they're selling not only to pre-qualified bidders, but they're selling to people who have accepted a non-contingent as-is close, which is just very, very rare. And that, again, is another piece for a seller in a market like this, where deals can oftentimes fall apart just as quickly as they come together, is a critical piece. So I think those to me are the big issues that you see from the advantages. Go ahead.
I think with, we were talking about it, was with the mass marketing campaign that we do. You have a very, very strong database. We have a very, very strong database. And I always, we always, as working with other brokers, we give the seller such great exposure globally, right? And maybe we'll talk about it later in the call, how with each of our auctions, how, we've had nationals purchase, we've had, Americans purchase, we've had sight unseen, and for the seller and also for the buyer, for their opportunity, and for the broker to be able to say, listen, I want to come in and I want to expose my client to this home. And finally, using our marketing tools, because we have phenomenal marketing tools. You do amazing, but Concierge Auctions has phenomenal marketing. And so for brokers, we just give them that little boost, to help finally close a deal. Subject free, no problems. And so I know you get it, right?
Yeah, no, I'm an enthusiast because I've seen it work. And those who are watching and have their doubts, feel free to reach out to me, because I am, again, I make clear to my sellers when we start the process, and Tina always laughs because I think she's I think she thinks that I'm trying to separate myself from her, but I always tell the sellers, look, I don't work for concierge. I work with them. I enjoy working with them. My job as your broker is to educate you on that opportunity and what I think they bring to the table, but I don't have a vested interest in selling via auction. I just think that it happens to be a great platform and a great way to reach the highest potential and probably the highest number that the market will bear. But I always tell my sellers that because I want them to know that they can come to me and ask very honest and open questions to me as the listing agent as to what my thoughts are on the process. Right. And I always tell them, if I don't think the auction is right for you, because it's not right for every person or every property, which we'll get into in a second, right, I'm the first one to tell them, this is not right for you. I don't think the auction is going to be successful for you, or I don't think your property is right, or I don't think your pricing expectations are right, whatever. So I do see real quick before we get into the next question. The next question is, you know, does my property qualify? How do I know if my property can go to auction? But before we go there, a quick hello to Adam, who's watching, I think, out of Jaco, and Marielle, who is actually an agent here in our Escazú office, asks for Tina, is the deposit always $100,000, or does it vary depending upon the price of the property?
The deposit is always $100,000. Does not vary. It's not based on what the price of the property is. That's it. And
great.
We rarely waive that. Rarely. Yeah. Like I would say 99.9% of the time, we do not waive that deposit.
Gotcha. So moving forward here, the next question, this is critical because I get calls weekly, if not daily, from sellers who want to sell their property. Right. And I think that from a broker's perspective, one of the things that makes the process work is that concierge turns down most properties as opposed to the contrary, right? And so I guess that bodes the question, right? What are the characteristics that concierge, obviously alongside to Costa Rica, what are we looking for, and what are the qualifications, if you will, for properties? Maybe let's talk a little bit about the characteristics.
Well, you know, real estate 101, you know, location is absolutely everything. I mean, you know, it's because everyone wants success within a cycle, right? So, you know, you and I focus a lot on that when we get phone calls from potential sellers. Concierge Auctions has a tendency to look for unique properties. That's what our database tends to look for. They have to be desirable, and when I say desirable, we're looking at it, you know, there must be kind of a liquidity of kind of 1.5 for it to kind of make sense, because that's what our database and is looking for, and that creates a unique property, certainly here in Costa Rica. And that's a general broad brush kind of comment I'm making, but sure. You know, certainly unique location, certainly the uniqueness of the property. And there has to be a market for that property today. You know, this is not for tomorrow. It's not for December. It's not in 3 years. Is the market looking for your type of home right now? And that again comes to seller expectations. And that's where you and I sit down and say, do we think we have a market for it? And is your expectation of where you want to be selling this home realistic? So
yeah, and one of the
factors.
One of the things that I tell sellers all the time is that, you know, if there's not a market and there's not interest today, it's not the right property. There, you know, the auction, what the auction does for that marketability is it brings a much greater attention, acute time frame, and sense of urgency to properties that have interest, but just, you know, people are looking at them, there's showings, but there's not enough activity or offers to drive the sale. And the final point, which you touched on, which to me is, those who know me and our company know, is, you know, probably where we start with our sellers, right? Seller expectation is, in my opinion, probably the most important aspect of qualification, obviously given it has to be a property with a location, all the other things that you mentioned. But we start an auction evaluation, if you will. If we have a seller that calls and says, Todd, you know, what do you think? Should we try the auction? Or I heard about the auction. What do you think? We start the process just like we would start the process on a listing in the open market. Right. We're going to go out there. In this case, it would be with you, and we're going to go out and we're going to look at the property, I'm going to provide a BPO, a broker professional opinion of what we think liquid market value is, right? We're not paying attention to what it cost them to build it. We're not paying attention to if they brought marble from Turkey or whether their architect was XYZ. We are going to pay attention to what our team, based on our vast experience, believes we can create liquidity in a market. That combined with your experience in the auction process, where we think opening bids may be, which, as you mentioned earlier, I mean, opening bids are where things start. That's kind of the worst case scenario, and a seller knows from there things are going to only go up with a competitive field.
Right.
But we're going to tell our sellers, here's where we think those opening bids are going to be. And I am the first one, and you are witness that I'm the first one to say, look, this is where those numbers, we expect them to be. And if you are not comfortable with where those opening bids are expected, I don't recommend you go to the auction, because the last thing that we want as a company, certainly Concierge the same, and our sellers, is we don't want a seller who goes into this with the wrong expectations to be let down or disappointed down the road. So we set very clear expectations from a pricing perspective. We don't control the outcome, neither I nor you. I mean, the market is what obviously dictates price. And sometimes that's a much higher price than we would have thought. Sometimes it comes in right at the range that we predict, but it's our job to provide realistic expectations, because we want our sellers to sign up knowing that if that's the worst case scenario for me, I'm comfortable, I want to sign up, let's move forward. I prefer that liquidity to a false expectation of some astronomical number that I may never receive. So that, to me, is the one most important qualifying factor in a seller taking their property to auction. So let's talk about the process, and I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, if you could kind of walk our listeners / viewers into what does the process entail from start to finish. How does it start? How long does it take? What does the process look like to get to closing? And then we'll wrap up the call with a couple of examples of some of the case studies we worked on, and then make sure we've got all the answers, questions answered that have come up.
Sure. So, circling back to, you and I get phone calls from, to go and visit potential sellers. We do our site tours. If we feel that the property qualifies for our platform, and we feel that the seller, with our transparency, is appropriate for the cycle, we then work with Danny, whose name's come up a couple times on this call. He's the business developer. Danny engages in a contract with the seller for the auction cycle. They usually start fairly quickly after we sign a contract. My job is then to arrive at the property. I am there for the full cycle, and I live, breathe, and eat that auction and that property, as you know. So Concierge Auctions, with your assistance, we work on all of our imagery, all of our virtual material, all of our virtual tours. So that is all ready for when I say open the cycle, we open the property for bidding, okay? Some cycles we've had are 4 weeks, some cycles we've had are 6 weeks. And as we previously talked about, my job is to tour the clients. We do an agent's open, like an opening presentation party. My job is to get bidders in place so that for finally, after we've worked all of our leads and all of the interest and all of the database, be it your clients, brokers' clients, or our clients, 3 days before, and I'm going to a non-reserve auction just because if we're talking about this, 3 days before we are set to open the auction, meaning we actually are open for bidding, you and myself and Danny sit down with the seller, with our field of bidders that, all of us have generated. And so I'll circle back to bidders are in a non-reserve auction are given an opportunity to put in an opening bid. And with that comes an incentive to provide me or the seller with what your opening bid is. That incentive is a percentage that will be a final discount off of the purchase price of the home. And I won't get into full detail with that. But with that incentive, I am able to provide the seller with the field or platform of where the auction will open. So the highest opening bid I have is where the seller knows the lowest price the property will sell.
Sure.
No one was to move off the bid. And that's very, very important that no one moves off of the bid. So the auction is normally open for 72 hours. Sometimes we've extended that. It is live. You and I work with new bidders that come in sometimes after the opening bid incentive has closed, which we've discussed. And then finally, when we come to, closing the auction, the winner has to increase their deposit 3 days later, and they must be ready to close on the property 30 days later. Is that kind of
gotcha? And that, yeah, and that deposit, that second, I call it the secondary deposit, that's generally to complete up to about 12% of the purchase price, correct?
Correct.
Great. And then after that auction's over and the hammer comes down, that's obviously when I take the reins again and bring the transaction to that 30-day close period.
Right. And so so bidders have already had an opportunity to look at the contract of purchase and sale. That has already been generated. This is an as-is only sale. So when that gavel goes down, the property is sold. There's no time for your attorney to come and review documents, or there's no to make changes. And that's what we're doing for the seller, as you know. But I basically hand this over to you once the gavel goes down.
Gotcha. And just to kind of step back briefly, when we talked about the 3 days prior to that auction, to the hammer, if you will, we're going to sit down with that seller. We're going to look at where the bids are, where those opening bids, those who qualified for opening bid incentive, and we're going to have the dialogue with the seller. That's that moment that we talked about early in the call that I call the parachute moment, where the seller has this one opportunity at that one point, and the only point in the auction, where if for some reason they don't feel comfortable enough with the field of bidders, the price, where they have that one opportunity, again, subject to a fee, a substantial fee, which we won't get into on this call, but they have the opportunity to pull the plug at that point and not move forward. And if they do move forward at that point, they are then legally bound to the sale of the property at whatever price that may be, which they already know is the lowest, the worst case scenario being those opening bids, correct?
Correct. And that's one of the reasons why we have very transparent conversations at the beginning of engaging in a contract, so that when we do have this phone call, which is usually the day before the auction opens, there aren't any big surprises, because you and I have always kind of hit the range that we said would be there. And again, numbers always change, but for the most part, you're kind of looking at 3 to 5 bidders usually. And we have been in that range, which is why when we have these conversations with the sellers where they choose to, as we call it, red light or green light the auction, we meet those expectations. And for the most part, we do receive a green light on our auctions.
Great. Awesome. Let's talk, because this all sounds real pretty, in the vague ambiguity of it all, but let's talk case studies, because at the end of the day, I think in real estate and in sales, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters are comps and people seeing real cases where we've taken properties to auction. Again, speaking from the skeptic mentality that I had going in,
right?
Danny could have come in and talked to me all day about concierge auctions and how pretty it is and wonderful, and they had great material and a beautiful logo and all these other things, but I didn't care. I wanted to see it work. Right. And so I think our buyers and sellers alike have the same mentality. And so I thought we could briefly touch on maybe just the defining points of some of the auctions that we've gone through, and what made it unique and what made it exciting or what made it different. And the first one I'll go back to was, I think our first auction that we did down here was Casa Infinity down in Los Sueños. Right. And this one for me, and I'll let you comment on it as well, one of the most unique factors that probably burst the false expectation or preconceived notions that people have about an auction, right? Most people think about an auction, as the title of this discussion states, as it's an act of desperation. They assume that An auction is for someone who's been out on the market for X amount of extended period of time. They haven't been able to sell. There's no buyers. And this is like the last hope. You know, can we pull the rabbit out of the hat at an auction and pull something together? Casa Infinity was a client of ours whose property was not on the market actively. It was never publicly listed. It was not out there. And he chose, after we presented him with the alternative, because he came to me and he said, you know, I've been in Costa Rica as a Canadian and been in Costa Rica for, I think, 15, 16 years at least, maybe 20 years. And he said, look, I know the market here. I know that my property in this price range, you know, $2+ million could sit for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And I think, you know, he decided to go to auction because he wanted exactly what you laid out. He wanted immediate liquidity, and he had confidence after, you know, multiple dialogues, obviously, that yourself, myself, and Steve Hooven, our agent, looks like he just joined us here out of Haco, was the listing agent in that property. And we took weeks to educate the seller as to the process and how it works in a very open format. And he chose to go with the auction because he wanted 90 days and out. And that was the motivation behind that. And I think the second unique factor about that particular auction for our Costa Rican listeners out there that may be doubters, the winner of that auction was not only a Costa Rican citizen, but he purchased the property sight unseen, located an hour away from his home, and he purchased based on videos and imagery that we sent him. And I thought that those factors were very, very unique. And one, you know, I think two other clients of ours from our database. He was a client from our database, and I think half the field that we had for that auction was concierge database, and half of the field was to Costa Rica real estate database. Go ahead.
Did he? Because I remember there was one. Did he not come in after we had opened, so he did not qualify for the incentive? Right.
Yes.
And that for me was, you know, that was our first auction working together, and it was kind of a 50-50 mix of my database and your database. But as I recall, he did not qualify for the incentive, right?
Yeah, he came in the day before the auction. Right. He was a client of our company, and he was a guy who, you know, he wanted it for end use. He wasn't an investor. He was looking for a home actively in this resort community, and it was the perfect match. And it was the combination of the mass marketing that caught his attention, and certainly the opportunity, because he had recently placed an offer on a condo in the community, and the offer was rejected, and he was able to purchase at a great price, a great property in the right community. I got a question. We'll interrupt here briefly this case study. We got a question actually from Steve, who says, hey guys, great insight. The auction is live for 3 days after the seller commits to opening up the auction. So how do the bidders increase the bids? Is it online? Is it via phone call? So I'll put this one to you, Tina. That's a great and you can answer that.
That's a great question, Steve. And I was remiss on not getting into that in further detail. So when you actually when you're a qualified bidder, you are given a bidder number, and you have two options. You can bid online with your number. Your name is not actually posted. It's all private. And during the last 5 to 10 minutes of the auction, we bring on bidder assistance, and I'm sometimes a bidder assistant. And you actually have the opportunity to dial in, and you are on the phone with your bidder, listening to the auctioneer. And at that point, if you have not chosen to increase your bid online, you have an option to increase your bid verbally with the bid assistant. But that doesn't come into play until 10 to 15 minutes before we close.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and I think one of the other things, anyone that's paid attention to the auctions has probably seen that oftentimes as the clock is ticking down to, you know, last call, and it's, you know, going, gone, and all of a sudden there's another 2 minutes on the clock and another 1 minute on the clock. Right. Just maybe touch briefly on the reason for that. Obviously, when there is a bid at the last 10 seconds of the auction, is that an automatic renewal, and how long does the auction go, in other words?
Well, it's not an automatic renewal, and I hate to say it's kind of case by case, because that's a bit of a nebulous answer, but it is kind of case by case. Sometimes. But
is it when there is a new bid at the final seconds? Does that allow? Yeah.
Traditionally, the auctioneer will allow for an extension. Now, we can't continue to keep extending because it becomes disrespectful to the bidders that are participating.
Sure.
But yes, traditionally, if we have someone come in right at the end, the auctioneer will extend 2 minutes or 3 minutes. It's not a significant amount of time.
Great. I've got another question here from Ingrid, who's also here in our Escazú office, and she's asking who pays for the property, the legal fees, transfer taxes, et cetera. And I can address that. Unique scenario in an auction is that buyer is actually paying all of the closing costs outside of sales commission. So legal fees, transfer taxes, stamps, and things of the sort for those familiar with Costa Rican real estate. Those are all borne by the seller. So again, another advantage for by the buyer, Those costs are borne by the buyer. So that's another advantage for the seller because those costs are oftentimes split between buyer and seller in a standard real estate transaction. All right, so that was the Los Sueños, which was our first run and was a tremendous success. I think we had 7 bidders, and again, a great mix between concierge clients, two Costa Rica real estate clients, a Costa Rican bidder that won sight unseen and that came in at the last minute. It kind of combined all of the components that we talked about today as to why the auction is a success. And it brought, for the skeptic in me, in addition to all of those things, one of the things that I thought, even though they weren't the winning bidders, I had 2 very high net worth Costa Rican clients who I believe the day before the auction or 2 days before the auction received one of our marketing pieces when the auction had already opened. And so we, at that point, one of the things I'm not sure we revealed or not, but once the auction officially opens and that seller has given the green light, we then publish the highest opening bid. And so when we did that, a lot of the other skeptics out there that maybe said, is this really going to happen? And is it really going to sell? And what do they mean, no reserve? When they saw where those highest opening bids were, generated a tremendous amount of interest from buyers that were clients of mine that I know for a fact would never have participated or gotten excited, made an offer, much less a site visit for a property or resort second home property if it hadn't been through the auction. And one client in particular called me in the middle of a very important board of directors meetings, and he walked out of the meeting and drove himself down to the beach the day before the auction for 20 minutes. It's an hour-and-a-half drive. He drove there, looked at the property, 20 minutes, turned around and drove back to have to get to a meeting. From a guy like this with the profile that he had, where he is used to people coming to him, can I drive you there or can I fly you in my helicopter and how can we get you there? And for him to make the leap to say, I want to go and I know I need to go now. And he knew he needed to go now. Why? Because I told him, I need $100,000 in escrow. I need your proof of funds, no exceptions. And that the limitations and requirements that set forth by concierge via the platform is really what drove him. Well, I have no choice. Buyers like that in our market particularly are not used to having rules defined for them on how and when to participate. And that, at the end of the day, drives sense of urgency, which is, those in our office here and sellers and buyers alike that know me know that's my credo, right? Sense of urgency is everything in real estate. So,
well, I think what's interesting is that group of clients from our first auction in Los Sueños have continued to always reach out with every other auction we've done in this country consistently. You know that because I reach them through the database that I work with, and they contact you, and they have remained committed to our process. They haven't had a property to sell, but they remain very, very much engaged with whatever else we're doing. And with each auction we've done, that list has grown, right? And it's grown with your brokers also that work with you, that we've had these repeat. And I love that because it shows that the platform is working here with education, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Every auction, I see a lot of the same names that get excited. Both our local clients, the Costa Rican or foreigners who live in Costa Rica, as well as a lot of our international clients.
Right.
And they feel like they missed the last opportunity. And so they want the next opportunity, which is exactly what, frankly, we and our sellers are looking for, is people to be excited, waiting for the next opportunity that you and I are able to filter out and bring to the table.
Right.
The next one that we can talk just real briefly was Villa Punta de Mar, which is a property that we had in Punta Leona that we sold. And I think one of the this was a very different scenario. This was a property that was previously not listed by our company. It was listed by a number of brokers in an open listing.
Right.
And I think it was on the market for 2 or 3 years at what I openly told to these sellers at a grossly overpriced and just unrealistic number.
Right.
They called out of, they saw some advertising after the success of the first sale, and they called in and wanted to understand the process. Great guys, living in Costa Rica, out of Colombia originally, and we got along very well. I was very open and direct with them, and I told them up front, if the number that I see published today is what you're expecting, then the auction is not for you, because we do a great job and the platform works, but it doesn't create miracles. Right. And in the end, like you mentioned earlier, we really gave them a realistic range, ended up selling the property to a neighbor in the community who saw the marketing, who came in and purchased the property, and it was a success for buyer and seller in that case for sure. I see a question here from Julie, who's asking, Julie Bear, and she's asking, what type of fees are the sellers responsible for? And so I think I'll answer part of that question because it's the part that puts a smile on my face, but you can answer the other part. Typically, in the process, the seller's responsibility as it pertains to the broker is that whatever our listing agreement states. Obviously, real estate commissions are still borne by the seller. They are not responsible for the closing cost, as we mentioned earlier, but they are responsible for real estate commissions. And then Tina will talk a little bit about the only other exposure that they would have will depend on whether or not the winning bidder had an opening bid and they qualify for the opening bid incentive.
Right, and that's again is if we have a bidder that has qualified and wins the property and has put their opening bid in, which is their incentive, which is a percentage that will affect, other than if the seller chooses not to move forward with the auction, which is another fee that they may have to pay. And you're right, that's the only variable, is whether we have a bidder that comes in before the incentive or after the incentive, which is a fee that they will have to absorb also.
Right. So Julie, just to be clear, so the two potential fees outside of the real estate commissions would be, number one, if the seller for some reason wasn't moving forward and the 3 days prior to auction they decide to pull the parachute, as I referred to, they would be responsible strictly for the marketing fee. They wouldn't pay the real estate commissions because the deal did not close. So in that particular scenario, their only exposure would be the marketing fee for pulling away. And if they do close outside the real estate transaction, the only other potential financial expense with them would be if the winning bidder had an opening bid incentive, which would be then deducted from the proceeds to the seller. I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to write us back and we'll be happy to address that further.
And I think also, Todd, just to note for Julia, so that if it's a reserve auction, then that fee is not there, right?
Correct. There is no opening bid incentive and therefore no deductions for a seller if there were a reserve.
Exactly.
In which case, the only expense for a seller in a reserve auction would be the real estate commissions. I see a question here from an old friend, Randy Burns. Great to hear from you, Randy. What are the auction fees? So outside of the seller's fee, the auction fee, or what I believe Concierge refers to as the buyer's premium, those would be the fees. Obviously, a buyer who comes into the process will be responsible for the closing cost, as we mentioned earlier, and potentially the auction fees, which is also a percentage of the closing price. The buyers have the advantage, which is what we always tell our buyers early in the process, is that the buyers who place that opening bid incentive have the ability to basically offset or come close to offsetting those auction fees by signing up early and qualifying for the opening bid incentive, because the opening bid incentive, while it may vary in those fees depending on the price of the property in the auction, it's a percentage that typically parallels the auction fees, so the opening bid incentive and correct me if I'm wrong here, Tina, but the opening bid incentive is typically the same percentage of what those auction fees are. The only difference is the opening bid incentive is a percentage based on the opening bid, not the closing bid, whereas the auction fees are based on the closing bid. So I tell my buyers all the time that while I certainly understand and respect their desire to leave a little bit of cushion in their opening bid so that they can potentially compete and raise their bid, the advantage of placing a bid that's higher or closer to their ceiling is that they can basically offset most of those auction fees other than the closing costs. So hopefully that answers your question, Randy. If not, feel free to follow up and we'll address that for you. Briefly, we can discuss Via Estrella, which is an auction that we did in Ocotal. Very, very unique auction, similar to Punta del Mar, which was in Punta Leon. It was a property that was on and off the market for the better part of 3.5 to 4 years, I believe. It was not a property that was listed with Two Costa Rica Real Estate. We do not have an office in Ocotal, which was a unique scenario for us, and I was very open with the seller about it. We don't have a presence there, and she said, look, we've exhausted our local presence anyway. I'm not concerned with whether you have an office there. We want exposure, and we want to get the best opportunity, the best exposure we can for our property. So we took that property on, and I guess one of the unique factors, in addition to having bidders from both our database and your database, again, is this particular auction sold to a bidder from the concierge platform who purchased sight unseen. Their first visit to the property, I think, was the day of or the day after closing.
Yeah, and it was sight unseen, and it was the last day that the incentive was applicable. And I believe he phoned me at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they are always looking to increase. They have a rental portfolio. And I got a phone call from head office, concierge, and the woman said to me, listen, I think this gentleman actually wants to get in and compete. And I phoned him, and it was basically sent him the details. He had the contract of purchase and sale, and he had the rental revenue numbers, and he ended up winning. And it was a great fit for the property, remember? I'm just going to stand up here for a second. I have to charge my computer, so I apologize. I'm going to move around.
No problem. Everything in the COVID days of virtual Zooming is allowed. As long as you have no one in the background that's running to the restroom or anything, everything is allowed, and charging your computer is good. So
I just noticed I had a little red bar, so I thought, well, you know what? We'll stop that right now. There we go.
No problem. That was a perfect fit. It was a property that was used really more than a luxury home, luxury residence. It was a property that really was a business. It was a vacation rental home and had tremendous rental income, and it worked very well for the portfolio of properties that the buyers had. So it was a really good fit, and we were happy to see come from the concierge platform. So that was a good fit as well. The last one that we'll talk about just briefly, because I see we're coming up on the hour here, and I don't want to take too much of everybody's time, but just briefly we'll talk about Bella Rosa in Ojochal. This was a listing, again, that was not a listing that was previously listed with Two Costa Rica Real Estate. It was a listing. Ojochal is an area just south of Dominical. Dominical is probably the more popular, well-known neighbor to the north, at least on a global presence. But Ojochal is more of a unique community to the south, gastronomical focus, and really beauty and a lot more land and remote. And it was frankly one of our fears going into the auction was the area a little bit too remote, and we did the typical process. We went in. We actually, in this particular case, because we have agents in the area, we sent a team of, I think, 3, if not 4 of our agents from the southern zone to go look at it, because it wasn't a property we knew ahead of time. We really needed to understand the setting and the pricing. And again, we set very realistic expectations. In this particular case, we gave the seller a very drastic change in reality from what our perception of expectation of price was compared to where they were in the open market. They had been on the market quietly, but had been on the open market for, I think, a couple of years. And we just felt that they were off on pricing, and we told them, here's where we think those opening bids are going to be. We think that the market value is here. I think we ended up hitting that number within $20,000, in fact, in the sales price. And I remember telling those sellers very openly we had about an hour and a half call walking through those numbers. And I was upfront and said, look, if these numbers are not on a range that's comfortable for you, then the auction shouldn't be the solution you're looking for. You can wait until better times. Real estate is cyclical, and in the future, that price may come back around to you. But today, I mean, the auction is a process that's 90 days. We cannot base the auction and pricing expectations based on, I think my view is better than somebody else's. It's about what do we think the market's going to bear? What do we think a competitive price will be given the conditions of an auction? And again, we were, I think, within $20,000 of what that number was. And so again, and that was an extremely successful scenario. I think I mentioned early on the call, we had a buyer that came into the process within 30 minutes of the close of auction with bank letters. I mean, I was on the phone with him. The auction was underway. Bidding was moving forward, and he was on the phone with his banker and his lawyer on the phone with me, moving things along. And what was interesting for the sellers in that particular case, while this bidder did not win the auction, he came in second place, and his last minute participation is what drove the property, or the price of that property up, I think close to 25% or something in the final 2 minutes of the auction. He was very active. And so for sellers, the important thing to remember there is, it's not over till it's over. And our team, concierge and to Costa Rica, and all of our agents are working literally up to the last second to try to bring more people into the process. And for the buyers, there's no risk. I mean, the buyers, if it ever the bidding goes higher than your comfort level, you step aside, you stop your bidding, you walk away, and you get a refund of your deposit that's in escrow. But if you don't place a bid, you miss the opportunity. It's just plain and simple.
Well, and I think, something just to add on to that was that the clients that won that property had bid on Ocotel, which was the previous auction, and they were unsuccessful with the sight unseen bidder. So they were very, very pleased that, they were able to have success, and they were looking for something that had some rental revenue potential. And 50 gray hairs later, because it was a fun auction, but it was a tense auction. And they don't always end up, playing out that way. But we certainly did the sellers a good service there, and the buyers were also able to achieve a property, at a value at a price that they were comfortable with.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, if I don't see any other questions, I think we've gone about an hour and 10 minutes, and most people get tired of me after about 10. So I don't want to bear on their Friday, and I think we've covered from a very high level the process, how it works for buyers, for sellers, why participate, buyers and sellers, the advantages. I would welcome anyone who's watching this to engage with myself, with Tina, with your listing agent. If you're in any of our other offices out there on the coast, feel free to reach out. We would be more than happy to walk you through the process, answer any unanswered questions that we weren't able to get to today. If you're a seller and you're looking for an evaluation, there's no commitment whatsoever. It's part of the process, and we're very happy to do it. We'll walk you through the process. We'll go take a look at your property. We'll tell you where we think values lay, so that you can make an educated decision as to whether or not you're better off in the open market or whether or not the auction is the right platform for you. And again, I'm happy as a broker to speak to my personal experience from the broker perspective as to how the process may work for you. So again, thanks for everybody for joining us. A special thanks to Tina for taking time out of your Friday to join us as well. It's always a pleasure, and I am sure I will be hearing and seeing you soon.
Well, and thank you to everyone that took the time out to listen to the two of us talk for an hour. And again, if there's answers that you need from the concierge side, I'm here and available. Todd has my contacts. And yeah, it's a fun process, Todd. It's a great process for buyer and seller, and I really look forward to working with you in the future because I think we're doing good things out there for this country, and I think the platform's working.
Yeah, absolutely. Likewise, Tina. It's always a pleasure for us, and it's great to be able to bring creative solutions, frankly, to our sellers. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So I appreciate your support and the support of Concierge, and look forward to our next auction coming soon.
All right, and everyone have a great weekend, and thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Stay safe. Take care.
Bye.